sort of online. Who will discuss IRD's founding statement on Christianity and democracy. So
yes, we're so glad my predecessor,
there he
Ken
is.
Till, can join us. All of you are familiar with our Christianity and Democracy founding statement written by Richard Newhouse in 1981, and that was added on to after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War in 1991. It's a wonderful statement. We still live by it, but maybe it's time to make another amendment to it. We can have that conversation. But Ken Till knows the history, so we welcome his insights and reflections. Thank you, Kent.
Well, it's I think it's been 38 years since I've been at an IRD board meeting. So anyway, it's a privilege. It's a privilege to be with you. I'm sitting in the back seat of a car while my wife is in the drugstore in Elkins, West Virginia. We've just been to the doctor's office, and so that's why this is a little bit of an unusual setting for this. But let me get right to the heart of the questions that Mark asked me. I won't speak too long, and that way, if you have any comments or questions, we can go from that. Mark asked me the question about the history of the statement and what involvement I had with it. Some of you may know that when IRD was founded in 1981, they chose to run the organization for the first 5 years without an executive director or president. A member of the board, Penn Kemble, basically handled the activities of the IRD board. And so the manifesto, which dates to about 81, was approved, edited, written, of course, mainly by Richard John Newhouse and George Weigel, Michael Novak, and the key mainline Protestant folks who were on the board at that time. Ed Robb, of course, was the chair for many years. So that's how the history of it got started. When I came, I was put on the board of advisors that first year in 81 when I was teaching at Seattle Pacific. And then I moved across country in 86 to become executive director. And later they changed the name, changed the title to president, where I served for 6 years. And so I inherited the manifesto, and that was the key linchpin for all our activities, the principles under which we did our work. And the question Mark asked me was, reading back through the manifesto, how does it stack up to what we faced in 1992 or 2024? Does it need to be changed, et cetera? And when I read it last night very carefully with that in mind, I came to the conclusion that the manifesto is as good in 2024 as it was in 1981. It's a document of principles. The principles don't change. The context in which the principles were discussed have shifted quite a bit, and it's that which I will address right now with a few comments. The context then, of course, was the threat of communism, but more specifically, the failure of the mainline church world to address the problems of religious freedom often caused by communism. And so IRD existed to take that task on. We were like the David against Goliath. One of the big changes that has occurred in the last almost 40 years or so, of course, is that Goliath continued to decline. I think in some part because of the challenge that we made to it, but it's not there. IRD does not mainly exist to deal with the problems of the National Council of Churches, the World Council of Churches. We still exist, you still exist to deal with democracy, promote democracy, and most importantly, religious freedom. So what's changed besides the fact that the NCC and the WCC no longer exist as powerful forces out there? The big difference, of course, is the religious climate in the United States. These 40 years has seen a significant acceleration of the secularization of the American culture, the nuns, the growth of the nuns, etc. And that is what has changed. And so you might ask, well, what difference does that make to what's stated in the manifesto? And I think there's some really interesting changes that have occurred because of this post-Christian America world that we have moved into, or at least a more secular environment than in the past. And that's this. The big change is the democracy that IRD always promoted and talked about the founding principles for is much weaker in a post-Christian or more secular environment. The percentage of the voters in America shaped by Christian values who can go beyond narrow self-interest in their voting patterns, who can be generous, who can be inclined to be forgiving, who can resist the pressures of the state for the state to move into the vacuum produced by the demise of religion, the defense of religious freedom, that democracy informed by a religious constituency, those things no longer exist, which means it's a tougher task. It's not at all certain this experiment of democracy without what Michael Novak would have talked about in the spirit of democratic capitalism as one of the pillars, of course, being a virtuous citizenry, informed by Christians who believe in natural law. When that's gone, all bets are off whether democracy as we want to see it will survive. So IRD has to think about what does it do to promote democracy and religious freedom in an environment that's a tougher environment to promote it than in the past. So I think that's the biggest difference. I'm trying to think if there was anything else I noticed in looking at this. Obviously, communism still exists, is still a threat, but that's not the biggest problem we face. The biggest problem we face is under our very noses in Western society. Let me give you one example of how significant the change is over the last 30 or 40 years. Let me see if I can find my notes on this. In 1993, IRD was present when Chuck Schumer and Edward Kennedy introduced the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which passed the Senate 97-3, passed unanimously in the House, was signed by Bill Clinton. And the purpose of the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was to ensure religious freedom in America. Now, fast forward 25 years to 2018, every single member of the Democratic majority of the House passed the Equality Act, which is designed to mainstream LGBTQ rights and which explicitly states that religious freedom, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act may not be appealed to if someone in the LGBTQ community charges that they have been discriminated against. That is a staggering change in 25 years. It's not passed, of course, yet, but it's the big agenda item for the progressives, and many so-called conservatives or folks in the middle are feeling more and more pressure on that. IRD has to figure out how to deal with a situation that would have been we would not have thought the major threat to religious freedom would come from within our borders, and so that's where we are. So, what are my conclusions with respect to what you do, both with the manifesto and sort of setting your own agenda? The problem's not the manifesto. The manifesto anticipates indeed a lot of this by talking about the principles that are essential. If those principles are under siege, then we're going to have a problem. But that's a foundational document I don't think needs to be changed. What would be useful would be an additional document, which would basically be to address the question of how you are faithful to the manifesto in this new century. And that would mean you address how do you advance our agenda with nuns and without the powerful force for creating virtuous citizens that is so critical for for religious freedom and for democracy to survive. So, I mean, that's the way I see it. I think the manifesto is great. It's still good, still valuable, but a document that might talk about the context in which the manifesto must be pushed forward in this century, that would be, of course, useful. So that's just some quick initial thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much, Kent. Are there comments, questions?
I have a thought, which is, in the light of the context which you just summarized, I wonder whether the founding document suffices in the event that we are challenged in our tax status, for example, under, let's say, possible more adverse administrative environment and or future presidency. Is there enough in there to make it clear that we are a religious organization and thus can advance claims to First Amendment protection if challenged? Or do we need to make sure that kind of thing is maybe even more explicitly addressed in an additional document like the kind that you recommend? I doubt, for example, that our document mentions our idea of believing in natural marriage, or that men and women are men and women rooted in Genesis and so forth. Do we need something like that for legal security, or am I excessively paranoid?
I'll mention that my organization, we did read the bylaws. And one of the reasons for doing that was to establish in our bylaws the statement of faith. That then represents an addendum. The addendum is the statement of faith that includes the scripture references. We've been advised by lawyers because of Supreme Court decisions. That's one of the best ways to protect ourselves.
We did that at RFI, and then which is a multi-confessional organization, and also published a crisis toolkit to help groups like us to be able to do that. It probably is worth. I always skim through the bylaws before these meetings, looking at procedural things. Yeah, and hadn't thought through a statement and that type of stuff, including whatever staff signs and board members sign.
Right.
So that's probably a wise. It may already be there, but it's faint in my memory what we've done here. Actually, I think Jim probably has the most institutional knowledge on this.
I did a word search in our bylaws for faith, and I didn't see anything regarding statement of faith.
Right.
It helps you with, getting exemptions from the law, right? So internal personnel issues, who you hire and so forth. But as far as what you're expressing, I really don't think it gives you any benefit over general free speech protections in terms of what you're doing. So that's something to.
Yeah, it's hiring, right? I mean, you're in so much hiring.
In the beginning,
Benefits.
in the beginning of the organization, there wasn't the agenda of aggressive, the left being aggressive to try to compromise organizations by getting their own people in under the guise of LGBTQ double, triple, plus, whatever agenda, but there is now.
Yes.
So worth looking at.
By the way, the hiring process at the Religious Freedom Institute became where at the beginning of the hiring process, and again, it was a non-confessional statement. It was a statement actually that said that religious freedom considerations trump all other considerations in the choices that we make. And an applicant affirms the understanding that this is the position of the organization, that there's no other consideration that would trump a religious freedom consideration. And I will tell you, it made people inquire about employment and not apply.
Oh, well, that's good. It's good.
And then, people who are going to check us out, 9 out of 10, 99 out of 100 are not going to apply because of who we are. But there's that, there is and there were some young people who I think were legitimately interested in what we did because they kind of cared about pluralism. But when they read that, they realized that there were state, religious freedom limits, and it did keep people from applying.
Of course, the threat to religious freedom for organizations of these types is really going to be no longer from a secularistic perspective. It's competing religious perspectives. The agendas of the sort of Hasidic leftism and progressivism are now increasingly couched in spiritual terms. And so I think the era ahead is not going to be a secularistic era. It's going to be competitions amongst religions where a simple commitment to religious freedom, therefore, may not be sufficiently availing.
Yeah. It's the best that organization can do with Muslim employees.
Yeah, of course, of course.
By the way, since Kent is on the line, if you come to the Victims of Communism Museum, you will see an artifact presented by Kent Hill to the museum earlier this year. And it is Kent, you want to tell them about that little piece of paper that you gave to the museum from the Gulag?
Yeah, and it's very much connected to IRD in the sense that it was something like 1985 or 6, don't remember exactly, mid 1980s. One of our religious freedom awards went to a Soviet or a Russian physicist, Mikhail Kazachkov, who came to IRD for that event, etc. And he gave to me, and he gave to, I think, 3 or 4 other people, an artifact from the Gulag, which was a small tissue paper, 2 inches by about 3 inches, written on both sides, that the inmates would write on, so small you could hardly read it, needed a micro, you need something to make it larger, and written on both sides. And if the guards came and they were going to do a search, they would swallow it in plastic and later retrieve it. This was one of those pieces of paper that I've kept all these years, given to me when I was at IRD, and have wanted to find a place to make sure it could be preserved, because IRD played a major role in defending people like this during those years. And so I'm delighted it's found a home.
Kent, what's written on the paper?
I don't even know. That's somebody's doctoral dissertation. I could never, even though I know Russian, I didn't have the equipment to look at it closely enough.
Oh.
And so I think that's an interesting question, what it is. I don't know.
We tell people it's Holy Scripture, but they don't
Yeah.
read us.
Dr. Marshall,
Yes,
Emily posted in the chat. I want to make sure her comment was seen.
sorry, thank you. What does it say?
She said, Graham, that's a good question, and I can take a look too. And she said that she agreed with Kent's observation about current threats in the US and would be glad to work on an addendum.
There's one new message below it.
Yeah,
If we
I
did
might just add one thing, if I might, based on something that Eric knows very, very well. One of the conclusions for the Religious Freedom Institute in terms of advancing principles of religious freedom that we came to and then made a kind of mantra for RFI, I think is equally a mantra for IRD, which is religious freedom is important because religion is important. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is this is not the time to make just a series of rational, objective, common sense arguments for why religious freedom promotes a pluralistic society and societal good. And that's all true. That's not going to help us. And that's not going to win. The reason it will not win is this. There is a connection between the rise of secularism and the demise of religious freedom. And this brings me back to a book that Richard John Newhouse wrote back in the late 70s or 80s, The Naked Public Square, in which he made it very clear that it was a myth that you could have a neutral public square. There is no such thing. Secularism is not neutrality. Secularism always becomes hostile to religion. Invariably, that's the principle of it. It doesn't believe in transcendence. It finds transcendence and the notion of natural law and God to be a threat to their autonomy. And thus, the bottom line here is if religion does not have a revival, we don't have another great awakening in this country or in the West, we're not going to win. So one of the arguments we need to be making is religion is a good, not just religious freedom. And we need religious freedom to promote religion, but we want religion because it is the source of morality and virtue and what's necessary. And so it's a slight shift to recognize that we don't just defend pluralism, we defend the importance and the value of religion itself.
I like what Kent said. I think it's very important what Kent just said. Religious freedom is a foundational freedom in that there is an appeal to something greater than the state. If you lose that whole dimension, you have no recourse against the state when you talk about justice or injustice. And so I like how Richard John Newhouse understood religious freedom as a foundational freedom from which all other freedoms come, because we can appeal to something that transcends the state and therefore have the basis to criticize the state when it's, stepping over people's rights. So thank you, Kent, for expressing that.
Yeah, I see IRD is ought to be out there defending all churches and all religious groups, frankly, that are threatened by the new, assault on religious freedom, because we have to have those entities free so that they can do their work. I mean, the first line of Newhouse's document, his manifesto, is the most important political task of the church is to be the church. It's not to promote a political agenda. So the churches, religious groups are under siege. IRD has a major role in protecting them, because if you don't protect them, religion cannot flourish again and be revived.
Yeah, but just on a point you made, Kent, about not only the importance of religious freedom, but that's important because religion is. I would commend. I was at Mark, and maybe some of you last night at a Trinity Forum event where David Brooks was interviewing James Davison Hunter, and one of the themes which came up so very strongly was the sort of psychic and moral chaos of many younger people and older ones too, because they no longer live in a morally ordered world, and they're told, you can decide, what you believe or what your ethics are. And they didn't mention that, but Nietzsche was talking about this when the nihilism, there is no structure, you stare into the abyss. He says, and eventually the abyss stares back. So without that sort of religious structuring, people, a lot of people, especially younger ones, are falling apart at many levels. I mean, certainly social media and the screens play a part. But it's much more than that. So, and that was one thing. In terms of this discussion, we've had comments that the original founding documents on Christianity and democracy hold up very well, but there might be two things we want to do. One of them is an additional document expressing what that document would mean in the present day. What, in light of that, what are we called to do? So should we seek to have such a document? And secondly, related to this question of revision of the bylaws in terms of protecting IRD's own religious mission. And you mentioned something else, was the
Maybe with the 50th anniversary coming, if we were to do a statement, I'm cautious about rewriting massive manifestos which are hugely time consuming and are often just blowing off steam. But a tight statement, maybe it can be focused ahead on the 50th anniversary, which is actually not very far away.
When is it?
2031, right?
Okay.
Is that right, Mark? Chartered in 81, so maybe
When
that's
you're my age, you know, it's all.
A number of us will still be alive at that.
a number of us still on the board.
Some of us might still be in charge of the treasury, the finances. Okay,
Sorry.
would someone suggest, thank you again, Kent. Do we
Sure.
want, want to have a resolution in terms of possible follow-ups to this?
I think it might be nice to let Mark digest
Do it.
this and come